Trevor Hold is the publisher of the Australian Advocate. As an ultrapreneur, Trevor is involved in several business ventures ranging through farming and agriculture, counselling and mental health empowerment and advocacy services. One of the many articles in the Australian Advocate, which is out now, is about the fertiliser crisis. As with energy, we really should be questioning what has become the status quo and create change. Now, isn't it funny how the big voices in government and big business have promoted resilience and sustainability, but their policies have created the very opposite? Trevor Hold, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here on after a refreshing long weekend. Hopefully you enjoyed your weekend and you're ready to tackle another week this week.
I did. Isn't it awful though? I didn't want to come back. I mean, I wanted to come back, and I'm thinking, wow, I actually like to sleep in. How was your Easter, by the way? Did the Easter Bunny bring you any Easter eggs?
Yeah, I had my fair share of Easter eggs and back into the diet and exercise starting yesterday. So I had a bit of a 4-day break, and hopefully everyone can enjoy a little bit of extra festivities over the long period, but get back into it. Get into the groove starting now.
Now, isn't it interesting when you have an article that explores how food scarcity really hasn't come into people's equations? They pop down to the supermarket. That's where the fruit and veggie, they're all grown there, of course, if you didn't know that. Just add water to the meat and there you are, it's all waiting for you. So they really haven't thought much about it. That's about to probably go headlong into a brick wall, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very concerning time for everyone, I suppose, and the current circumstance that Australia finds itself in nationally is hopefully a big eye-opener to people on how dependent Australia has become on foreign interference, I suppose you call it, because without the oil supply or without a diesel or petrol, then at the moment Australia is very vulnerable. And obviously, like you mentioned, the fertiliser supply and a lot of these things aren't done in Australia. Our industries have been declining for decades, and our ability to be able to do stuff on shores has basically diminished. So it is a very interesting time that we find ourselves, Mike, and hopefully we can rectify that situation, enlightened by the troubles that we find ourselves in.
How do we get to this point? That's what because we have an education system. I know it does fail on many fronts, but at least they are sort of intelligent. And then we have the lack of food, which it is going to be. If you walk into the supermarket, you'll see you get less for more. And boy, do we have a deal for you. One lettuce leaf is only $58,000 trillion. But people say they understand that bit, but they don't understand that that eventually, unless we have fuel, unless we have better government policy, what you would have paid for that lettuce leaf would be way in the past, and whether you can get that lettuce leaf, because you're going to have a great deal of scarcity when it comes to produce.
Yeah, I don't know, like from my personal perspective as a young man, I done an apprenticeship and I was promoted, and there was promotions on TV, learn CNC machining, computer numerical control machining and robotronics, and learn how to code and do all these automation things, and that's what my trade was, and we tried to set that up here in Australia many years ago, and there's been a lot of people that have done that, like in regards to like brake drums, tilt train axle boxes, and all sorts of products that can be mass produced. But the biggest problem in Australia is obviously you got your liability and your workers' compensation and your occupational health and safety regulations, which for example China doesn't have anywhere near as many bureaucratic red tape scenarios as Australia does. But also labour in Australia is quite expensive. So we were sold a dream to learn all these things, learn how to code and learn how to program, and you'll have a job for life. But these things aren't done in Australia anymore because we're not able to be competitive
Mm.
because of this free trade environment. So even though we're being penalised with additional, and rightfully so, with additional, occupational health and safety requirements and all these safety things, but also all these liabilities and insurance costs that other countries that don't facilitate, then and it costs us more in labour and all that sort of stuff. But and now when we're importing all this stuff with the free trade agreement, then suddenly all these things that these other countries can do a lot cheaper than us because they haven't got the regulation, they don't have the safety requirements, and they don't have the labour costs that Australia got, then that dream of learning how to code and how to make stuff automatically is all offshore. So and that's one of the biggest problems we got, because you stop making things in Australia, like even fundamental things like steel and all the main things, and suddenly you're very dependent on the import of these things. And when there's problems with the supply chain, like we see now just with oil, then the whole system can collapse.
Mm. They really have been drinking the Kool-Aid, just the general population, when it comes to climate change. I mean, the propaganda or the information overload and the information operation, in fact, from the particular governments, whether it's state, local, state, or federal, seems to be working very well indeed, because they don't understand that this terrible thing called oil. It's in just about everything we use, and you take that oil away, and you eventually just grind down, don't you?
Yeah, and it's a lot of the knock on effects as well. Like energy costs, for example, that's another factor that we've got. A big burden on individual businesses and even householders. The cost of that compared to other countries, when it comes to manufacturing, then that is a big burden. But also the primary production of things are also affected by that as well, because obviously we need to build stuff to be competitive and be able to create affordable agricultural products or primary producing products, and that all requires time and energy and innovation as well. So to be competitive on that regard, so innovation should be a number one priority, and Australia should be known as an innovation capital of the world. But having that sole focus on net zero is, I suppose, blinding or blinkering people to other potential industries or other potential avenues to create innovation around these things.
Mm, totally agree with you. The fertiliser. Let's talk fertiliser. I mean, if you're in Nauru, you should be able to grow giant carrots. The whole place it's just bird poop. And that's not being terribly nasty, but it's the fertiliser capital of the world. But if you look at Australia, without that fertiliser, things don't grow very well, don't grow much of it. In fact, some farmers would say, no fertiliser, we don't do any work. Tell us about fertiliser, and in particular, the synthetic fertiliser.
Yeah, and there's a big dependence, like you mentioned, in farming, especially like the massive broad scale acreage farming, and a lot of these things with the fertiliser, and the problem that I suppose occurs is you get reliance on, it's not just fertiliser but also the pesticides, and creates the demand for more fertiliser, and you get stuck in this perpetual loop of more pesticides, more fertiliser, and the soil health is declining over time. And obviously, the bicentenary was 1988 in Australia, so we've been here, for what's that, nearly 250 years or whatever. And over that time, you can see these broad acre operations exponentially increase these synthetic chemicals into the soil. And obviously now, without these synthetic approaches, the soil is not capable of producing in a lot of areas. So I feel it's a perpetual loop that we find ourselves stuck into, and it's just trying to find alternative ways to be able to manage this stuff a lot more naturally as intended by nature. So it's not about not producing bulk food. It's just about adapting to more sustainable and more independent sustainable methods.
Yeah, we're very dependent on, aren't we? without fertiliser, we sort of stopped just about. What alternatives are there? I mean, if we just say, for example, if it keeps going the way it is and you can't get your fertiliser in, what alternatives? What about? I mean, we've had a gentleman on talking about his fertiliser and it's more natural and works better, but it's not that easy, is it?
No, well, I think that's the problem with where we're at in Australia at the moment. As a entrepreneur, it's obviously funding to get things off the ground, and it's not good enough or not enough in this country to have an idea. Back in the day, back in the 80s or even earlier, back in my grandfather's day, for people to go into business, they just tapped the sign in the ground and said, we're open for business. But now there's so much capital required and so much red tape required to be able to get into business with permits and council approvals and all this other stuff. It's very difficult. So, for example, if you wanted to start for example, a worm farm, you'd have to, there's a lot of equipment that you'd have to do it on a mass scale. And, the capital investment to do that is quite significant, but also the time it takes to get through the approval process and the cost of that approval process is enough to stifle any projects, you know what I mean? So I feel that in order to be able to support these innovations, we've got to have a system in place that allows people to progress forward, and then instead of trying to recover any money up front that individuals like me or whoever's trying to do the project have to come up with up front, and then if you fail you lose your investment, you're better off supporting that project and getting off the ground and try and recover the money from the taxes or whatever on a successful venture rather than trying to stifle it at the very start.
And I agree with you there too. I think things have become quite complicated. I'm just thinking about those worms. And you've had experience with the government of fire ants. I mean, those worms, they're like the anaconda. And you don't want those worms escaping, do you? Because could you imagine a stampede of worms? It would,
Yeah.
but without being too frivolous, I would imagine the government's very concerned about worm farms. And is it because of health and safety, or is it because it's alternative?
I feel it's about control. I feel that having independent people come up with independent solutions that are sustainable stop these big corporations from getting their chemical solutions out there. And I feel that's what it is. So I believe in commercial solutions simply because they create a competitive environment where cost-effective, fit-for-purpose and customer-focused solutions are created. So without supporting commercial business to be independent and competitive, then I feel that the bureaucrats can help their mates out more and have control over the whole industries, which is quite concerning. And a good example of that is the transport industry with independent truck drivers. It used to be a lot easier now to register a truck and be an independent driver for yourself. But now, for example, one example is registration of environmentally relevant activities for your trailer. It costs you the same amount of money if you got one trailer or 5 trailers to pay for that permit. But then when you get 20 trailers, the cost per trailer is significantly lower. So a person driving one owner driver truck cannot compete with the Lindsay Foxes of the world that have lots of trucks, and then that enables them to buy, for example, pay for extra hours for their road fatigue management plans and develop all these other things as well that the single independent operator can't afford. So it's across every industry and across every sector. And I know we're talking about fertiliser and we're talking about this, but that's what it's the same sort of issue. Doesn't matter what industry you're talking about. Is there's no diversity on there, and government policy is specifically focusing on getting the big guy going. And making it so you have to go and work through that system because they can control the tax a lot easier. They can control or the bureaucracy that easy, because them guys are cooperating because it's a multi-million-dollar business for them. But the individual operators and the independent, small business and independent operators are being flushed out of the system, and I feel that's losing a lot of innovation and losing a lot of core competitive behaviour in across all industries.
Just your own personal opinion. Do you think I'll tell you mine in a second. You know, when you pop into a supermarket and they've got all the, not a whole lot by the way, but the fruit and veg on one shelf, and then they have the genuine organic section. First of all, do you think it's any better for you, the genuine organic section? Because at my supermarket on the Gold Coast, it looks very sad. It looks like it was once fresh, until they picked it up off the floor, because it looks terrible. I mean, it looks terrible. They're wilted, and then I look at the other fruit and veg, which looks pretty sad too, but not as sad. But so, what's your views on the organic? You know, the stuff that's been no chemicals, no whatever, hasn't been touched by any human being, or do you think the other stuff that's just pumped out full of, they got everything on it because it looks better? The organic stuff, truly, it looks like our garden. It's terrible.
Yeah, and there's a few points I want to touch on that.
Yep.
Organic farming is, especially domestic stuff in Australia, is at risk of losing its credibility at all in this country, because the government under different programs are able to ignore or disregard domestic organic producers, and that's quite a sad situation for everyone. So the ACCC recognises that any domestic operator can make an organic claim, for long as if they have the evidence to back that up. And there is a standard, Australian standard, Licensed Through Standards Australia, AS 6000, that actually has a framework where people can do that. But government departments are ignoring that framework and ignoring that standard, and actually walking over people's rights and distributing toxic chemicals or genetically modified derivatives of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and just failing to recognise domestic land management and organic producers. So it's actually a quite sad situation in that regard. So there's a twofold scenario where DAF, the Federal Department of Agriculture and Fisheries and Forestry, they have their own export standard for export overseas. But when we talk about, as you know, I've been involved in the National Fire Ant Eradication Program, they've actually misrepresented their use of organic certified or organic compliant products that they've been distributed for fire ants, mainly the product Engage. For 25 years, they lied to the public saying that was an organic product, when in fact it did have GMO derivatives inside of it. And they've been spraying this stuff everywhere, all over paddocks and all over properties, and forcing it on organic properties, saying that it is organic. And then in August last year, they come out and said, "Oh, hang on a minute, it's got GMO derivatives in it," because the legislator for GMOs does not require GMO derivatives to be declared in any shape, way or form. So in Australia, there's no necessary requirement to declare the use of GMO derivative products in produce or anywhere. And that really does compromise the whole organic industry. So this is a very serious issue that's just been ignored throughout the whole of Australia and all the governing authorities. And I feel it needs addressed pretty quickly, because these things are non-compliant with organic operations, and yet the government have been lying and distributing them all over the place. And when they do come clean with it, they only recognise properties that are accredited to the export certification, when they're not exporting anything. There's no requirement for them to be accredited, which costs them thousands of dollars to be accredited to that standard. And they've got no need to if they're doing it domestically. But then operational procedures in these programs are just ignoring domestic markets. So it's a really concerning situation at the moment with the organic producers and land managers. So I really am focused on trying to create some resolve on that matter. But when it comes to organic stuff looking a little bit terrible or seeding, I feel that we're a little bit precious that it's got to be perfect. I know there's a lot of waste at Coles and Woolworths because they've got a no and no go. They call them go and no go gauges, and the lettuce has to go through this gauge and not go through this gauge. And then if it doesn't fit that dimensional criteria, then they throw it in the bin and literally goes to waste. So I feel organic produce, it's disappointing that we have to go through a lot of standards to say it's an organic produce. But we should just call it an apple instead of calling it an organic apple. And ones that are poisoned, why don't we say, oh, that's the poisoned apple? So I feel that might make a little bit difference and a little bit more reflective on it. So instead of saying it's an organic apple, how about we just say it's an apple? And how about if we use poison on it, let's call it a poisoned apple and see how that promotion goes for them, But it doesn't work that way, which is very, very, very unfortunate.
Can't tell the truth. But speaking of apples, I saw some apples in the organic area, and I wasn't sure if they were prunes. Even we bought some the other day, and they weren't too bad. But the Brussels sprouts or Brussels gouts, they were $1.48 at our local supermarket. And the organic ones, of course. But the end of them, you looked at the end, you thought, is that a living, breathing animal there? It was pretty, it looked pretty bad, but it tasted all right. We bought it because it was cheap. But it's, the organic section of the supermarkets, Woolies and Coles, they're appalling. They are truly, truly bad. Oranges. Look how spongy the orange is.
That's why I recommend going to the farmer themselves. Get to know your local producer and go direct through them, and you'll get the best quality food. It will look very good, and
it's healthy too.
And it's healthy. So just in my regard, because it's not just about being organic or non-organic as well. It's also methods of ripening. There are, for example, we got bananas, and our bananas are tree ripened, and a tree ripened banana is going to taste a lot more sweeter than what they do is normally cut them green and keep them in a chilled environment or whatever. When they're ready for sale, they gas them or whatever and to ripen them up. And that's pretty standard practice for a lot of the Cavendish bananas across the country. But having, tree ripened plants, and you just be patient whenever they're in season, and when they're green. And what we do is we turn our green bananas, for example, that might blow down in the wind or whatever, into flour. So we make our own banana flour. And we chuck them through chuck them through a grinder and that after we dehydrate them and turn them into flour. And then if they're ripened too quickly or too much before sale, then we chuck them in the dehydrator to make what's called banana buttons, which are just dried banana jerky basically, and they're beautiful products. But people that just buy bananas from the bulk suppliers don't really know what a banana tastes like because they are quite flavoursome, So, so there are different issues as well in regards to that.
Yeah, nothing like a good banana. I got to tell you, we had some bananas a few weeks ago. They were magnificent, and actually they were Cavendish too, which are pretty damn nice. But at our house, what happens is that if the banana looks a bit sad, it's going to pass away tomorrow, it becomes a smoothie.
Yeah.
And but I don't drink it. It's far too healthy for me. Let's talk about, because you're well known because of your ant stories. I mean, those pesky ants. But the stuff they're spraying on the ants at the moment, that weapon of controlling the ants. Bee farmers aren't all that happy with it, are they?
Yeah, it's quite disturbing, especially obviously I've been focused on the fire ants in the southeast Queensland portion, and they're using chemicals like S-methoprene and pyriproxyfen, and what they use is like a corn grit and it's a genetically modified corn grit that actually takes the starch out of it, so it becomes more absorbent with the genetically modified soya oil, which is actually genetically modified so it can suspend the active ingredient in it. And it's either pyriproxyfen or S-methoprene in the area that we're using on is what they're using prophylactically. But there are some in the yellow crazy ants where they're actually using fipronil. And fipronil is a known PFAS chemical as per the Australian definition of what a PFAS is. And it's actually on the Australian chemical map as being a PFAS chemical. And they're dropping this stuff out of the back of helicopters on a broad scale to prophylactically treat for crazy yellow ants. So very similar to what's going on here. But what happens is these things do get into waterways. They do mass damage. They are impacting the soil health and are impacting worms or other things in the soil. But having it as a PFAS chemical, which is a cancer-causing chemical to humans, dropped out of the back of helicopters to they're not even controlling yellow ants. They're spreading similar to the fire ants scenario. But regardless on what the chemical is, these pollinators, the programs say that they can't pick it up because they got like a straw nose and they can't eat the corn grit. But what happens is the oil does separate from the corn grit, and it can either end up in the in a water or a puddle of water or whatever where bees can drink, or when they drop it out of the helicopters, there could be open flowers there, and the corn grit could land in the flowers, or the product could land in the flowers, and then it can separate from the corn grit and leach into the nectar and kill off whole hives that way. And that's the concerning thing about some of this science that they use and some of the statements that they make. They're denying that they use the PFAS chemicals, a known cancer-causing chemical in humans, which is completely and utterly false. Fipronil is a PFAS chemical, is on the PFAS map of Queensland. I've looked into that extensively, but also the fact that it doesn't kill pollinators, where they're just having one scenario, they can't get the active ingredient because they can't pick up the corn grit through their straw-like nose or whatever, but mouth or whatever, but there are circumstances that can evolve beyond their control where it does affect the pollinators. So, but these chemicals are not targeted. They'll affect any insect that comes in contact with them. And then there's effects of biomagnification and bioaccumulations that occur as they go up through the food chain that can impact us. And there's no research on this, and there's nothing getting done because they get their blinkers on and they find a problem and they try to address that problem, but they don't want to look at the overall picture of it, So it's quite concerning about how that all works. So, we've got to keep pressure on and hold these guys accountable for their actions.
Where did they get the name, the Townsville Yellow Crazy Ant Management Program?
Well, they weren't crazy. They weren't crazy. They were just yellow ants, and then they started dropping fipronil on their homes, and that's what made them crazy. Before that, they were just standard yellow ants, I think.
We're in Vietnam. They had Agent Orange. Now we got the whatever stuff they're pumping on those poor ants and poor bees. What's council doing about this? Obviously, if you know this, they obviously know it. Is council? Throughout Australia, are the local councils saying, enough's enough, we have to look after our locals here, or are they going, yeah?
Well, we done an article the other last month, I think it was, about the Gympie Shire Council actually poisoning and affecting a local organic farmer there, and he complained to council about it. And the arrogance of the council workers, they went and done a big patch of public land just out front of his driveway, just to show, look, we got poison, we can do what we want with it, and that's what they do. So I've raised a little bit of awareness to my local councils here, but I haven't got very far with them. But it is something that we're pursuing. Obviously, the development of alternatives in regards to our FASO machine, fire ant suppression soup operations for treating fire ants, but also because we can do steam and treat weed with the low flow hot water system as well. Then we want to try and get some research done on the effectiveness of of not using poisons, because what they're doing is they're
We've lost Trevor. He'll come back to us in a second. He actually froze. I mean, see, the council have stopped that internet. Maybe they turned his electricity off. No, he's still frozen. So hopefully he can come back to us in a second as I do. I fill it. No, he's completely frozen right now. See what happens when you eat those bananas. Something like that. Trevor Hold there, by the way, the April edition of the Australian Advocate. It's out now. Look for the article too, Ingredients for a Perfect Storm, the Fertiliser Crisis. It's all very serious to say the least.